My name is Peter Honeywell. I am on the board of the ONN, and I'm also the executive director of the Ottawa Arts Council. It's my pleasure to introduce you to our closing plenary panel. 2018, a year of elections, advocacy, and stories from the trenches. As we prepare for the coming double year of provincial and municipal elections in Ontario, we look forward to hearing inspiring stories of how nonprofit champions sparked connections to candidates and parties, helped their communities, and the issues be heard. These nonprofit changemakers will share their experiences, what they did, what they learned, advocating for communities, and influencing public policy during election periods. As the audience, we want you to think about how the nonprofit sector can leverage 2018 to make positive change in Ontario. It's my pleasure to introduce our moderator. This is Nam Kiwanuka. Kiwanuka.
Hi, everyone.
She is a multimedia journalist, the host and producer of TVO's The Agenda with Steve Paikin, and our changemaker panelists include Debbie Douglas, Executive Director, Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants, Tim Gray, Executive Director, Environmental Defence, Susan Pigott, Chair, Mental Health and Addictions Leadership Advisory Council to the Ontario Government. So welcome to you all, and over to you now.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you to the ONN for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. I'm looking forward to learning from the panelists here. Looking forward to speaking to Tim, Susan, and Debbie. But before we started, there's something I've been thinking about a lot after what happened last year when President Trump was elected. And this is not to disparage him in any way, okay. But let me just finish.
I don't need to worry about that.
But what I find myself thinking about a lot is how many Americans who are eligible to vote decided to opt out for voting for anyone. And it's something that I'm thinking about a lot with our upcoming elections next year. A lot of people say that kind of stuff wouldn't happen here, but you just never know, right? So 43% of eligible voters in the US didn't vote in the last election, and that's approximately 100 million people, which is so shocking. So I'm just wondering from the panelists, how can the nonprofit sector build a healthier democracy? Tim?
And after I answer this, people like Trump will never get elected again.
How do you solve the problem?
Well, I think it's trying to make our issues relevant politically, and also having supporters, members, volunteers, board members who represent some of those people that don't feel engaged enough to actually come out to vote. That is one of the problems. We know some of the demographic information around who votes and who doesn't, and quite often younger people are those who are not showing up at the polls. How do we make the process relevant to them so that they feel that they have some influence and that voting actually makes a difference? You quite often hear that, like, why should I bother? Because they're all the same. I'm not 30, and I just think, when I hear that, I'm just like, no, it's not all the same. Policy matters, and if you advocate responsibility for voting, then the people who end up getting elected will impose their will on you. So it's really incumbent upon all of us, I think, who work in the sector, to try and figure out ways that we can encourage our supporters to take policy seriously, to engage in a way where they understand that it's politically relevant, and that to express themselves at that sort of macro level. What kind of government, what kind of politicians do you want? That it means showing up at the polls. I know for us as an organization, we've spent a lot of time trying to translate some of the work that we do, which can quite often be complicated. If you're working on like a new environmental assessment act, right, and you're talking about strategic environmental assessment legislation, unless you're a professional, that seems a little dry. So, how do you translate that into things that supporters and the public can understand, and so they can know whether or not the commitments that have been made by governments have been followed through on, and therefore, how they should be informing themselves about voting and then showing up to vote. So that's some of the things we've done. We really encourage people in the lead up to elections to get out and vote. Of course, we don't tell them how to vote, but we do remind them. We tell them where they can get more information, et cetera. And I think all of us could do more of that. I think there's a bit of a fear in the nonprofit sector, especially in the charity sector, that doing anything during the election period is just somehow you're going to get yourself in trouble with Canada Revenue Agency or Elections Canada or Elections Ontario. And I think we really need to know the details around that and make sure that you're not doing too little rather than too much.
Can you expand on that? Why fear?
Yeah, I mean, I think with charities in particular, when the last government was in, there was all of this talk about how charities are doing too much political activity. And so the politicians were always talking, in sometimes very vitriolic terms, about the charitable sector, in particular the environmental sector, and how we were engaging in political activity, which to the public and often reported in the media sounded like that we were being partisan. But the rules under CRA, political activity isn't being partisan. Political activity is things like sending an email to your supporters and saying, you really should write to your MP about this law that's being passed, or you should really care about climate change. Those are all political activities. They're not partisan, but under the rules, the definitions, those are seen as political activity, and the public doesn't understand the difference. So that scared a lot of charities off from doing anything in the public policy space, because they were worried that they were going to be attacked by government and that they were going to be audited by the CRA. And that has spilled over, I think, into the non-for-profit world, beyond charities as well. And now with some of the new election financing rules and election spending rules, people don't have necessarily a clear sense of what they're allowed to do during the lead up to elections and during the writ period. And I think all of us as volunteers or as staff in the sector really have to make sure that we understand the rules and that we're engaging in a way that is obviously within the rules, but isn't just telling everyone in our organization to stay home and not engage, because then our voices aren't heard, and the issues that we work so hard to raise in the public space are not put into these election cycles. So we need to know the rules for sure.
Did you want to add something, Debbie?
Yes, just to say that there's also a fear of loss of charitable status. But my sense is, though, that many of the charities in our sector seem not to understand that even with the rules around charitable activities, 10% is a hell of a lot of political space to be able to do work. But certainly I think that the government we had federally for the last 10 years, pre-2015, certainly didn't help in terms of encouraging that political chill, recognizing and people seeing the examples where they didn't mind taking a hammer, right, to many charities. So I understand where the charitable chill was coming from. But I wanted to go back to your original question that you asked Tim around
democracy.
Democracy.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure that, for me, I was looking at it from the system itself. One of the concerns we've had, so for example, municipal elections, the voter turnout is very low. Even here in Toronto, if we hit 40%, we're doing quite well. And the groups that my organizations work with, who are immigrants and refugees, often come from places where they have been very active politically. And they come into Canada, they're wanting to get engaged in their communities, and yet our policies don't allow immigrants to vote. And so people, they take the 4 or 5 years it takes to become a citizen, people become disconnected from the political process. And so then it's starting over again. And so for me, I think our work then is, even when people can't vote, is to engage them on what's happening within their communities, to begin to work with them to make the links between the decisions that city councillors are doing and what it means for their day-to-day lives, is to engage them in terms of what provincial and federal governments are responsible for and how it is they can become engaged outside of the electoral system, so that voting becomes just one thing that they can do at the end, but that they're completely engaged and able to voice and meet with folks who down the road may want their vote, right? But they're also being able to influence policy and policy priorities.
That's
Can I just add a little bit, just very quickly? People vote when they care passionately about something. So if we as a sector are able to engage our constituents, whether it's our service users, our board members, our communities, in the policy process, in between elections, so that people become passionate about the need for change, they'll vote. I was saying to somebody just before, our 19th Prime Minister, Kim Campbell, in 1993, said elections are no time for serious policy discussions. And everybody laughed at her, but in fact, it's true. The serious policy discussions have to happen all the time, and then the election is a time for people who are passionate about those issues to express their voice.
I mean, engage is such an interesting word to me. When you say engage, how do you do that if people don't seem to connect to issues unless it's something that's affecting them?
Well, I'll give you an example from sort of some of the work I did in the past. One of the issues that's really, really hard to get people engaged about is income security at a technical level. Not raising the rates, but changing the architecture about how money flows through our system. And so when I was at St. Christopher House, now West Neighborhood House, we kept thinking, we can't just keep making the moral argument because we're only engaging the same olds. How are we going to engage a broader audience? And we started to think, well, who's interested in the subject of tax reform and who's interested in income transfer at a high level? And we suddenly realized that down on Bay Street, there are entire buildings that are full of accountants and tax lawyers who do nothing but try and figure out tax implications and tax policy for wealthy people. So we thought, well, let's go and try and talk to them. If they knew how shoddy our public policy is when it comes to low-income people, they'd have a fit. And we were right. These are very fastidious people. They are proud of their craft. They actually became totally engaged. I use that just as an example because it's easy to engage people who are all in your red room, as Tim Delaney said. But I think we have to start to engage people who are outside the red room. And you have to be a little bit creative and a little bit social worky of sort of trying to think about, well, who else might be interested in this issue? And it's not always the same old people.
Well, one word.
So that's one example.
A phrase that I've been hearing a lot, I don't know if it's off social media. I live on social media, so I'm like, that's my world, that's the world. Is a social justice warrior. I'm curious to know, as people who work in advocacy, what do you think of that phrase?
When I was 20, I was a social justice warrior. Social justice warriors are the young people who work at Advocacy who have no fear. They don't want to hear about your charitable status. They don't want to hear about funding. What they want is to identify an issue and to be given the space to be able to go out and try and change and make social change.
But it's something that you're hearing more for
absolutely.
bigger organizations. Now it's becoming something that I feel kind of writes off the work that the nonprofit sector is doing.
No, there's a conversation that we've been trying to have that talks about, and it's not to put down anyone who does service here, but talks about when services are not enough.
Yeah.
Right? That yes, we can provide services that meets people's material needs, but we also need to work at the policy level. We need to make changes so that we're not providing food through a food bank. You see what I mean? Mm-hmm. We need to look instead at how do we ensure that people have a living wage so that they're able to purchase their own food? How do we ensure that food is affordable? What are the changes we need to make to ensure that we don't have food deserts in low-income neighborhoods and in low-income neighborhoods that are increasingly racialized? So then how do we ensure that the foods that we do make available are foods that are culturally appropriate and foods that people want? So for me, when people talk about being a social justice warrior, those are the very real issues that it is that they're trying to address.
As long as our sector, our not-for-profit sector, sees ourselves just as service providers, we will be seen as just that.
Yeah.
And I don't need to point out to people that one of the issues that is alive and well is, from funders, is there too many of us and there's too much duplication? Well, if we present ourselves as social service providers, that begs the question. There probably are, if that's all we were doing. One of the things I think so fabulous about the work ONN's doing with the mutual benefit concept is we're much more than that. And the more than that is what Debbie's just described. And when we are more than that, the social justice warriors want to be with us. If you're a young person who's a passionate social justice warrior, you're not going to be terribly interested in just making sure that, you know, services are provided. These people have much bigger dreams than that, and so do most people in this room. So that's what I think about it.
Yeah.
Tim, anything to add?
Yeah, I think you're seeing increasing engagement in pushing the edges of change from younger people. I mean, it's a younger person's game generally, but I think there's more of them. I know in the environmental field, people are, they're just tired of not having the fundamental structural changes be made to our society that is going to allow us, our civilization, to survive. Like, we don't address climate change. Like, we'll be having any of these conversations in, in 10 or 15 years. And I think young people, of course, rightly understand that they have the most to lose. I mean, they're the ones that are, they're definitely going to be maybe just entering middle age when they can't drive to work if they live in Vancouver anymore because they'll run into the ocean. And they don't want to hear from politicians about how, well, we can only do a little bit, we can't do this. They just don't have any patience for it. And I can understand it. And they end up being the sort of the front lines of what you see as some of the environmental conflicts, like pipeline battles, et cetera, because they just do not want to have any more of the status quo because they don't think it's survivable.
Well, this panel is called Stories from the Trenches, and I'm sure a lot of people here would love to hear, as myself, how you all got started in the nonprofit sector. We'll start with you, Debbie.
Oh, God. Student activists, got involved in creating York University's first women's center, worked in anti-racism work with TDSB, was a youth worker at YWCA, got involved with the union, got suspended a lot from not doing the work I was being paid to do. Then moved into the violence against women sector, worked there in frontline and in management, and as a director of our first Immigrant Women's Center, and then jumped into community development, worked for years as a consultant where I worked with executive directors and made all these grandiose plans and left them to implement it. And then I became an executive director at Advocacy and thought, well, BS.
All in 1 minute.
all in 1 minute. And then I landed at Advocacy almost 20 years ago.
Well, I always find it interesting when you speak to people about what drove you to do the work that you do. Like, what was the impetus?
Social justice. I often say that I was born and my mother's milk had social justice in it. I come from an activist family. My family's from Grenada, and my mother's older sister, my Aunt Mary, was very much involved in the Grenadian Revolution, for example. My family has always had a sense that we are each other's keepers. And so I always had a sense that I had a role to play in making wherever it was that I landed a better place than how I met it. And so, from the time I've known myself, I've always had a commitment to social justice issues.
And Susan, what drove you to work in this sector, and also your resume?
I started out my professional career as a psychiatric nurse. And I think what was very pivotal in that experience was that I was working mostly in the emergency department, and it became very, very clear to me that the medical model, this is a long time ago, like in the late 70s, had such severe limitations, and that many of the people who were experiencing mental health crises were living in conditions that would induce mental distress in almost everybody. And that was sort of the epiphany for me. That and meeting John Sewell, who was doing his campaigning in those days. And I thought, you know, I'm much more interested in spending my time further upstream trying to improve social conditions. So I've spent a lot of time in the social side of things at Family Service Association, at United Way for a while with Robin, at St. Christopher House. I returned about 10 or 11 years ago back to my roots in mental health at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, but I have always tried to stay in a position in an organization where I can spend most of my time trying to enlist people and support people, mostly users of service, in the importance of tackling social conditions. I have a tremendous amount of respect for people in our sector who are drawn more to service delivery, and I want to make that really clear. I'm not disparaging that at all. I'm just saying that as organizations where we need to have people who are driven by the need for humanitarian outreach and direct service, we also need people who can work in partnership around policy issues. So, you know, I continue to be very, very passionate about this, and I have to say, being here today has just rekindled my sort of enthusiasm. Unfortunately, in healthcare, there's not the same sense of vocation and passion for social progress as there is in this ONN world, and it's really nice to hear what people have had to say today.
I'm curious to ask, what was it about being here today that reignited that? The free food?
Well, no, the food was delicious. Well, I'll tell you, one thing is that I see so many people here today who have been doing this important work for so long and are still moved and motivated to continue to do it. I also was really, really pleased to see how many younger people there are here today. I also have been extremely challenged by our panels, and particularly the panel at noon today, which I think excited me by the potential of a whole new frontier of activity if we can actually start to move in the way that they suggested. It opens up a whole new world of possibilities. So that's why.
And Tim, what drove you to do the work you're doing?
Well, I grew up in a little town near Owen Sound, Wyerton, you know, the groundhog, you know, the white groundhog. And so I grew up in a very beautiful place. You know, my family's house was about 2 kilometers from Lake Huron. There was Bruce Trail, etc. So I really loved it there, and I loved the outdoors, and sort of naturally became attracted to biology and science. And but I was also an insane political junkie at a ridiculously young age.
That's interesting. Was it around in your house? Or?
Not particularly. I don't know. It's just something went wrong in the DNA development or something. And,
or something went right. It's
I'm not sure what happened, but I remember like being like 6 years old and like, you know, reading the opinion columns and my parents making fun of me and begging to stay up late to watch Nixon resign because I was like 6 years old. Like it was a bit weird. So and I guess by late high school, there's a really nice beach near where I grew up, Sauble Beach. Probably some of you have been to it. But it used to be all sort of natural dunes with like roads going through it and all the natural vegetation. And then there was a huge amount of development pressure. They started bulldozing all the dunes, putting in paved streets, storm sewers. And I think it was around the time I was around 18 years old, the whole downtown, instead of just having sandy roads, they put in all these storm sewers. Well, guess where they put the storm sewer outflow for? Right at the Welcome to Sauble Beach sign. So you know that if you've ever been up there.
Yeah.
So the storm sewer outlet was right in front of the sign. And so all the businesses on the beach make their money from people swimming. And now all the chips and the grease from the cars and everything goes into the lake right in front of the sign. And I just remember thinking like, man, adults are morons. Like this is the stupidest thing I'd ever seen. And it was like, I think at that moment, I decided, like, I'm going to have to do something in this world, like, this sort of interface between humans and the environment. I didn't know how to do that. I didn't know how to meld politics with the scientific interest that I had. So I ended up going to university. I did get a degree, undergrad degree and graduate degree in ecology. And then while I was in university, a lot of the controversies around logging and stuff in Northern Ontario started going, and I was like 21 at the time. So I ended up in Northern Ontario with First Nations and actually ended up getting arrested and spending the whole day in a paddy wagon with Bob Rae, who was then the leader of the opposition. So I get to know him quite well.
So environment and politics meeting together.
And they met. And by then I'd chosen a thesis supervisor for my graduate work, and he was a very engaged scientist who was involved in acid rain research here at U of T. And our entire lab was involved in applied ecology issues related to impacts of acid rain, other pollutants on the environment. And from there, I ended up working for conservation organizations. Several of them did a bunch of work in Central America with communities around forestry. Came back, worked for a funder here in Toronto, the Ivy Foundation, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. I was program director there for a number of years. And then 4 years ago, moved from that right back into the advocacy space at Environmental Defense, which is a very policy-focused organization in the human health, environmental interface, and I love it. And so somehow I went from being a biologist, and now I just manage lots of people. But it's all been good.
I love those stories. I really did. Let's just circle it back to the election, and I want to hear more stories. If Debbie, if we can start with you, if you can give us an example of what worked well on an advocacy issue around election time.
I like to tell this story because it's because of the unusual suspects. It was 2005, and Canada and Ontario had signed their first Canada-Ontario immigration agreement. And we were celebrating. Ocasio was feeling very proud. We had been very much engaged in the negotiations for the first time. We had municipalities recognize their role in immigration and settlement, recognized. We had a Toronto annex. We had another annex with the Association of Municipalities of Ontario. And even more importantly, the money was going to be tripled. And this is under a federal Liberal government. Fast forward a few months, and the government, but they had a minority, and so we thought that maybe we should start courting the Conservative Party. They were eager to meet with immigrant and refugee organizations. They were phoning Ocasio 2-3 times a week, wanting to meet, wanting to get their platform on. We did, and then the government was brought down. So we had a few weeks to organize, and we thought, let's do a report card. And so we chose a number of issues, with the Canada-Ontario immigration agreement being the first one, asking the parties to commit to implement it regardless of who won. And to commit in writing to do so. And then we asked them another set of questions, and then we posted the results. And the Conservatives, because they had been in opposition for God knows how long, they were very proactive and pro-immigration and pro-racialized communities. So we actually gave them a higher mark than we did the Liberals.
Lo and behold, 2005?
Yeah, this is 2006.
Oh, okay.
Lo and behold, they win the election. All right, and we had the letter, and so we sent congratulations to the Prime Minister. We put in a copy of the letter that they had signed as a party in opposition about agreeing to implement COIA as in whole, including the tripling of funding, and they followed through. And so for 5 years, we tripled the funding in Ontario and across Canada for immigrant and settlement and integration, right? So that was a big win. Mind you, come 2010, agreement ends, and they slashed the hell out of the budget. So Ontario ended up losing almost $200 million over the last 5-6 years or so. So now we have a Liberal government. We'll see what happens with that. So that was a really good story in terms of going with instincts, paying attention to all the political parties, having them put in writing the nonsense they spew at us all the time, and then holding them and holding them to account.
Do you think that's a benefit in not having any bias towards any of the parties?
Oh, absolutely. I think that as nonprofits and as charities, we have to be nonpartisan. It makes no sense for us to be partisan, actually. I think we do a broad reach, and we see where the chips fall.
And Susan?
I can't think of an exact story like Debbie's. I can think of some strategies that have been very helpful. One has to do with encouraging service users to take advantage of elections, to have their voices known. And I think this is a big opportunity that elections do provide to service providing not-for-profits, is that it can be a way to try and actually engage people, whether it's seniors, whether it's low-income clients, whether it's mothers with small children, to actually understand better the political process and their role in it. And there's no question that that is a far more compelling message to local politicians than to have executive directors go out and speak on behalf of the people that they're serving. So I think, you know, there are lots of stories from mostly times when I was at St. Christopher House where we would actually use that strategy to good effect. The whole business about being non-partisan, I made reference earlier to our outreach with regard to income security to the sort of tax downtown Bay Street crowd, many of whom I don't know, but I don't think they were all necessarily liberals. And it stood us all in very good stead when the Conservatives were in, and Jim Flaherty, you may remember when he was Minister of Finance, he brought in the working income tax benefit for low-income people. There's no question that, in my mind, that the fervent advocacy of some of the tax policy people and the accounting crowd talking to him about this is the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do morally. You can't believe how shoddy our public policy is at the low end of the income scale here. You simply have to do the right thing. And as we know, Minister Flaherty was a man of principle. So that has to do with the sort of reaching out during and leading up to elections to people who may not, in a nonpartisan way, because we can't always know what the outcome is going to be.
I think there's, not being in the sector, maybe I have a misconception, but there's this perception that the nonprofit sector leans one way. Do you think that the public just needs to become more educated about that?
I mean, I think that it really, you end up gravitating towards the people that will take the things that your organization or the sector is recommending and are going to do it. I mean, I know for us, when we're engaged in the run-up to elections, we try and develop platform pieces that are reflective of where our supporter base is and the issues we're trying to address, but we also try to tailor them to the degree that we can to the political brand of the parties that we're working with. You think of the Conservatives, for example, they tend to be more, in the environmental world, more likely to favor something that would be like a market instrument, for example, like a pricing mechanism, for example. And you might get a very different approach from the NDP or the Liberals. So we do try and tailor those kind of things to each party. But I've had equal luck, I guess, or success with parties of different stripes. On a lot of these issues, it really depends on the motivations of key people that you manage to have a conversation with that are in leadership positions within parties. And I think the example you used with Jim Flaherty is a good one. And I've had that with environment ministers, say, in a Conservative government. The government brand overall might not be particularly friendly to the environment, but when the federal Conservatives were in power, we focused on some areas where we knew that they would be willing to move, even though broadly their environment agenda was very weak. But on toxic chemicals, they showed a willingness to move around banning particularly hazardous products in baby food and baby bottles and such. They banned BPA. Wouldn't have been, from the outside you would think, well, that wouldn't have been the government that would do that. But we built a relationship with the environment minister, and he wanted to do that. So I think it really is about crafting a message that's appropriate for the party that you're dealing with. And quite often, if you've been used to talking to one government that's been there for a long time and using the language that they're comfortable with, then it's a bit of a shift, because then you got to start talking to a new one, and they don't use the same language, and they're, it's a different tribe, and you really need to figure out how to talk to them if you haven't been talking to them for a long time. I mean, that's going to be the situation. Say the government changes in Ontario next spring. It'll have been 15 years of a Liberal government, and if you have a Conservative government, it'll be trying to figure out how to talk to them in ways that are motivating to them about your issue.
So we talked about the good news, the good successes. Anything that didn't work out, and what lessons were learned?
Oh God.
Long list.
But I tell this story, but I figured out we were being streamed live, so I'm not going to call names. But it was a provincial election. And there was a real, no one was sure where how the election was going to turn out, and and everyone was going after the immigrant vote, and so one of the things that we were pushing was around access to employment. Access to trades and professions and having credentials recognized, access to folks who are internationally trained professionals and tradespeople being able to enter the labor market. And we came up with a scheme where we wanted to take a look at employer subsidies as a way of enticing employers to the table to be able to begin to work with newly arrived immigrants and refugees. And the then governing party bought into it. And as soon as they put it out as a party platform, the opposition, both from the left and the right, slammed it. And so we began to mobilize, right? So like Susan, we thought, well, what's corporate Ontario doing, right? We've spent a lot of time talking with corporate Ontario. They were speaking the language of inclusion. They were talking about the diversity benefit. They were talking about diversity having real economic impact. And so we thought, there's an organization that is concerned about immigrant employment. Let's see if their board will issue a statement. At the same time, a lot of my political work is done in coalition with Color of Poverty, Color of Change. And so we had issued an op-ed which was carried by the Toronto Star, really targeting immigrant communities themselves so that they also can become engaged. Phoned up the executive director of this allied organization. She was right on it, brought it to the board. They slammed it down. Absolutely refused to make a political statement. 2 days later, and this is all building, right? Real pushback. The opposition is saying things like, this government wants to give our tax money and jobs to foreigners, and so that became the conversation, like really xenophobic pushback nonsense. And 2 days after, we found out from this allied organization that their board has vetoed any sort of public statement on this. They're not going to become politically engaged. Our op-ed was having a difference, and so we needed somebody else other than the usual suspects like Ocasio saying this stuff. We received a phone call from the party saying, we've got to pull back on this. So we're going to make a slight change. So we're going to change the narrative from access to employment for immigrants and talk about access to employment for new citizens. And please don't contradict us in public. Don't speak out against our change, because once we're elected, we will go back to the original request and the original platform. And I agreed. Biggest mistake we've ever made politically. They won the election, and all promises went out the window. They didn't implement for citizens. They didn't implement for immigrants.
And they had it on the record that right.
Exactly, right? And what was embarrassing for me and the council was that our friends in media kept phoning to say, why are you silent about this change, right? Why aren't you saying anything? The election is in 2 weeks. What's Ocasio's position on this? This has been your baby. You've been talking to editorial committees about all of this, and all of a sudden this huge change happens, and you're being silent on it. And I couldn't say, well, we made a backroom deal with friggin' Barty. And so I get teased a lot by some of my media colleagues about that. Yeah, Debbie, never make backroom deals. So that was a real learning for us, that never again will we remain silent when a party has backtracked or when the government has backtracked on something that's significant and meaningful to communities that we work with.
Did you ever talk about it after? Like call them out on it?
No,
Publicly?
actually.
Why not?
I've spoken quietly to various ministers since then about it, and government priorities shift is the response.
And I guess you have to be diplomatic for future.
And they want a goddamn majority, so they didn't need us anymore. And you have to be diplomatic because government relations is an important part of the work that we do, not only for the council but for the sector. Right. Susan?
Well, again, I can't think of a sort of disaster. I think a common mistake that I've been involved in is to become too enmeshed with one of the party's platforms, and then it becomes owned by that party. Mm-hmm. The issue becomes owned. I just can't stress enough the point during elections, the whole issue of presenting yourself as bearing witness. We have special information that could be useful to you, that could be useful to all parties. You just can't get seduced into saying things like, well, I'm going to have this particular politician come over and have them have a town hall at my organization because they think like us. I mean, it's just, particularly around election time, you just can't make that mistake. And the other thing I think I would suggest we often make a mistake in is that we are not assertive enough about what we know in terms of trying to put forward positions. This may be between elections or leading up to elections. And there's a whole sphere of activity around elections that can happen amongst your community, amongst your family members, amongst it all has to do with quiet electioneering, and it has to do with things like over the next 6 months you're going to be in lots of social situations where you're going to have lots of people saying certain things related to their particular positions, because everybody kind of gets caught up a little bit in the election. And you might find that you run into somebody, they made reference at the panel at noon today about the racist aunt or something, but my favorite ones are people who work as investment advisors who are experts on welfare cheating and who just, are absolutely, I'm voting for so-and-so because they're going to crack down. And we got to not back away from those conversations. We have to say, really, tell me, what is it in your experience day to day that's led you to come to this particular thing? And the reason I'm asking you is because I actually work with many individuals who are on social assistance every day, and your experience is quite different than mine. So I just wonder, and I'm sort of making light of this, but to avoid this kind of stuff is a mistake.
Do you think that actually makes an impact?
I do think it at least makes you feel better. You're not sitting there coming home on the TTC afterwards going, darn, why did I let them? But around elections you get a lot of sloganeering and you get a lot of false information, and especially these days. And our job is partly to correct false information, and not in a proselytizing way. We have to use our skills. We know what we know. We know what we see every day, and we have a responsibility when we hear electoral parties saying things that are not our experience, I'm not suggesting sort of hard-edged kind of slamming in public, things that are going to get you into trouble, but trying to encourage your community of supporters and service users to have these conversations and to try and correct people's views, even if you can't win them over. I think sometimes you can, but it just makes for a more thoughtful population than if we are too humble and we just go, oh, gosh, I'm not going to take this person on. Often we don't take them on because, I don't know, somehow we've bought into the fact that in this sector we're second-class citizens. I don't know. Everybody has a different reason.
Do you think that, would you say then that the work that you do is most important leading up to the elections?
Totally. I mean, I think it's ongoing kinds of work. There was a very famous activist named Javi Eckenberg at NAPO, National Action Anti-Poverty Action, who used to say, advocacy is not a drive-by activity. Like it doesn't just happen at election time. And Armin Yalnizyan, who we all listen to on CBC, has often said, you know, advocacy is a long haul, and we heard that from Tim this morning. So it's a lifelong commitment to bearing witness, having the courage of your convictions, and without alienating all your friends and associates, trying to correct misconceptions.
It's a fine balance, I guess.
Yeah.
It's a fine balance.
And disinformation, right?
And disinformation.
Tim, lessons learned? Things you've
Yeah,
done?
there's lots of things where I've tried with others to advance particular policy things during election. They just don't get picked up. That's sort of routine. You're more likely to miss than hit, it seems. But in terms of like a mistake, one that I think that is a recent and relevant one was not the most recent election, the one before in British Columbia. There was real pressure by the environmental community at that time to get the NDP opposition to come out strongly against pipelines, right? Like to the Trans Mountain Pipeline and the Enbridge Pipeline. And I think it was premature. I don't think the population of British Columbia had concluded to the degree that they have now that it was against their long-term interest to have these things built. And so, convincing the NDP to come out strongly saying they oppose pipelines, I think actually resulted in the NDP doing more poorly than they otherwise would have.
You're the one who cost them the election.
Yeah, wasn't me. Not my call. But I don't think that it was the right call, right? I don't think that was the right thing to be pushing at that time. The issue wasn't mature, and you saw, of course, most recently with the election there that issue again was front and center, but the population had moved, and the now NDP government is very much opposed to the remaining pipeline because the other one was canceled by the federal government. But so timing is quite often everything, and just because it's your issue, you need to think about like, is this the time that you really want it to be floated? And maybe it's not the best time. Maybe you'll actually do yourself more harm by pushing it forward right now than waiting till the issue matures somewhat.
We're almost out of time. I think we have about 10 minutes left, right? Okay. I'm assuming, just like in television, like you can't do this by yourself. Wanted to talk to you about your allies, and I know, Susan, you have a good story about that. Somebody that you worked with that helped you produce success in advocacy.
Well, I think I alluded to that earlier around the income security thing, but make no mistake, from my point of view, this kind of work is not something that an individual does on their own. It isn't, and in fact, people who do take these things on their own and become sort of lone rangers don't tend to last that long. I mean, you have to. It's a solidarity activity.
I think that's true for organizations as well. I think our most effective work happens in coalition. As I said, Color of Poverty, Color of Change, we're very much aware that any sort of movement forward happens because we're such a broad coalition. And we have various interests represented at the table. It also opens up political scope, right? When you talked about the impression that the nonprofit sector all tends to lean left,
I didn't say left. I just said lean one way.
well, live in progressive ways. Not that I think the left is necessarily progressive. Let me put that on the table. But I think working for me, if there's one message I want to leave with, is that when you do political work happens in coalition. I think that's when you're most effective. That's when you have the broadest interests at the table, and that's when you can make the best arguments. And that's when your allies really step up, because people see people are always interested in something that will make their lives or their positions move forward.
And as we've said, 2018 is going to be a really busy year, municipal elections, provincial elections. Tim, how do you think the sector should prepare for 2018?
Yeah, well, within our sector, the environmental sector, we've been doing this now this will be the fourth election cycle. We have a group we call Ontario Priorities, and we have about 12, 13 organizations in that. And we start about a year and a half in advance, and we try and bring all this stuff together that we think is electorally relevant, and then we make a really determined and disciplined effort to winnow it down to a few things that we can try and sell to each of the parties. Because as you can imagine, that list could be very long, and I'm sure with any collaboration within any sector, you could end up with like 30 asks, which is very difficult.
What's on your wish list for your organization?
Well, our top one organizationally is to try and get all the political parties to commit to a deposit return program for plastic bottles in Ontario. It seems like, why wouldn't we have one? Because, yeah, every other place in Canada except for here in Manitoba has one. And as soon as you have one, there's no more plastic bottles in the streets. And your recycling rates go from what they are now, which is around 40%, to like in the 90s, right? So it's really important and self-funding mechanism to clean up plastic. So that's, we're really headed to that space. There's a strong push from the environmental movement around protected areas. The federal government committed to increasing the amount of protected areas in Canada from 17% from the current around 12. So the province's place in that is sort of a key one as well.
And Susan, what about you?
Well, I'm in a different kind of a space right now in that, and this will happen to people who are fervent advocates, is once you step away from full-time employment with an organization, then you become easy pickings for the government of the day to become an internal advocate and try and advance, in this case, the cause of mental health and addiction in the province. So I've spent the past 3 years being an internal advocate, advising the Minister of Health. And this is an important role to play too. It's different, but it comes when people believe that you are more interested in the cause than you are in advancing your own organization or your own personal sort of agenda, and when you are seen to be a fair player. People aren't asked to be internal advocates if they are known for end runs and surprising and embarrassing governments.
Absolutely.
That is a strategy that people, and I'm speaking very personally to you here, if that is a strategy that some advocates use. That will limit your usefulness down the line and probably limit the opportunity to be asked to come and be an inside advocate to try and drive something ahead. So in terms of this particular election upcoming, we have given, we think, and this is my role now, this particular government in Ontario all the ammunition they need to be able to go to the polls and say, we can make a wonderful mental health and addictions system here for you. But that's different. And I just hope I'm making that clear. It's not, I'm not with an external organization at this point in my time.
But I think we can play both roles, right? I see myself as both an external advocate as well as an internal advocate. I sit on a number of government working groups. So, for example, the United Way has been doing a really good job of convening some of the organization that it funds as a way of bringing us together to try and find areas of commonality that we can then advance together in terms of doing public education around the various issues. But a working group on income security has just now released our roadmap. right? And I'm very proud. There's some issues in here, right? There are some gaps that I wanted to get in that didn't get in, as with most of these things. But the recommendations in here are strong. We're looking at investing right up front in terms of our social assistance program while the government tries and figures out basic income and all of those issues. And so for OCASI, along with employment equity, which we have certain standing agenda items that we've been pushing at all levels of government, but particularly provincially for umpteen years. So things like employment equity, which was done away, which we had for all of 2 or 3 years in the early 90s and was done away with in the mid 90s, trying to bring that back. Access to OHIP, Ontario, BC, and Quebec are the only 3 provinces in Canada that have this 3-month waiting period for access to health care for new immigrants, which is ridiculous.
Or new residents. I left the country and I had to wait for 3 months when I came back.
When you came back.
Yeah.
And the argument they're making is that they haven't yet figured out how to deal with the snowbirds going out of the country and coming back. And our thing is that often snowbirds are very much aware that it's 180 days and they're back in the country. And even if they weren't, right, these are folks who worked all their lives, contributed to our tax system. So what if they stay out of the country for 2 years and come back? Why aren't they getting health care? But back to income security, there are a number of recommendations in here that we'll be holding the government to account about, everything to do with child benefits. One of the issues we'll be pushing as Color of Poverty, Color of Change is that while we are very much in support of both the federal and the provincial child benefits regime, children of parents with precarious immigration status, because child benefits is delivered through the tax system, have no access to child benefit. That is a problem. Canadian-born children of parents with precarious status have no access to child benefits. And we know for poor families, whether or not they're in social assistance or they're working poor families, that those child benefit dollars make a hell of a difference every month. And so that's one of our key policy issues. And thanks for allowing me the space to do my public education rant on this.
Well, thank you so much to the 3 of you and for everybody for being here. I'm not sure if you touched on this earlier, but when we were on the phone talking before this, Tim, you mentioned Bill 2. Did you talk about this before? Did you want to talk about how that would affect?
Oh, the new election rules.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's something we've been digging into a little bit. I don't know if people are all aware of this. It was something sort of new to us, but just around prohibitions around advertising within 6 months of fixed election dates, which was November 6th, right? So now we're in that period where you really do need to register as a third party if you're going to be spending any significant amount of money advertising your policy positions. If those positions are, there's different views on them by the different political parties. If there's not, it's not as much of a risk. But for example, we don't have that situation in Ontario, but in some provinces you do, where you have one party that says, climate change doesn't happen, and then the other one says they're going to put in a carbon tax. Well, if you're out there as a non-for-profit, or as anyone, frankly, it doesn't have to even be an organization, spending advertising dollars either conventionally or in social media, anything over $500, you do need to register. So we've been sort of like looking into this because this is new, and I do think it has some real implications for people involved in the public policy space. But one encouraging thing about it, and we've talked to Elections Ontario about this, is that if you have a history as an organization of talking about that issue in the public arena, that they look at that. So you're not sort of saying, like, if you've talked all the time about climate change, you don't have to stop, even if the issue is one that is divisive between the parties, but you really do need to avoid any kind of tailoring any kind of advertising that you're doing in a way that would bring attention to the division between parties on those issues. So if you are going to be involved in spending money on your policy positions between now and the upcoming election, it's really worth having a look at the material that's available from Elections Ontario around that. ONN, I think, has a guidebook as well, which is online, I think, which is helpful.
Early December, right? Early December.
Yeah, it's coming out. And there is a helpline with Elections Ontario that you can call, and you can even send samples into them, and they will give you a determination whether they think it's too close to the edge. So really important thing to pay attention to. But don't run away from being involved in the election because of these new rules. Just learn what the rules are and make sure that your organization's adhering to them so that you don't get yourself in any trouble.
Thank you very much, Tim, for that. Did anyone want to add anything else? Debbie, Susan?
This is the time to be speaking to your communities and your program participants around issues that are important to their communities. Let's not wait until the writ is dropped. This is the time to begin to mobilize folk, right? I think that as a nonprofit sector, going back to the question about what's the role of the nonprofit sector, our role is to mobilize and to organize.
Thank you, David.
I would just add to organize and mobilize around issues that are important to your constituency, not self-serving advocacy around money that you may require. That's why we have organizations like ONN to be able to do that.
Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you. Thank you.
That was a wonderful panel, and I thank you, Nam, for facilitating that and wonderful discussion. My name's Maureen Fair, and I'm a board member of Ontario Not-for-Profit Network and side job as Executive Director of West Neighbourhood House here in Toronto. Just a couple quick reflections. I know some of the work that some of these folks have done over the years, and I think it's just amazing how effective they have been. So the lessons that they've presented today are ones that we can really take to heart for ourselves. Clearly, they had strong visions of what needed to change. They had confidence in themselves. They had confidence in other people's decency so that they could go to people they didn't know or unusual suspects and convince them of the right thing to do here, instead of maybe what sometimes we do, which is reconvincing ourselves over and over and over again of the need for change. And I would also just reflect that the 10% barrier or the 10% limit on political activity, maybe we should be setting that as a goal for us to try to get to 9.9% of your budget for advocacy work. ONN will be sharing an advocacy toolkit very shortly to support public benefit not-for-profit organizations about how to get involved in the year's elections. So that's coming out in the next few weeks. As we come to a close, I hope you've had an interesting day, a stimulating day, that you've had a chance to connect with other people, maybe people that you've never met before. This is a network, so we really need to make sure that you have as many opportunities as possible to understand what each other is doing. What's next? We're going to be reporting back and sharing what we've learned from the plenaries and the workshops through the photos, the social media, Storify, the note takers in each session, and some videos. So you'll see more about that in the days to come. We're going to continue as ONN to ask for your help and support. We need people to contribute as reviewers, to participate in working groups, to share information, and to provide your ongoing feedback and constructive criticism so that this network can continue to do the work it's been doing. I would encourage you all to join ONN as members and supporters. West Neighbourhood House is a proud member because, you know, Tim Delaney's speech this morning was just, I don't know about you, but it was just chilling to hear what's happening in the States. And let's make no mistake that it could happen here. It could happen very soon. And so we do need to make sure that we have an advocate and a watchdog like ONN on an ongoing basis, not just at times of crisis. So I really do think you need to consider, if you've not been able to pay for your membership yet, to please try to get to that. Only about 50% of the folks at the conference are ONN members. So let's try to up that to get this work really going. I'd like now to turn over to Gina Appel. She's a fellow board member at Ontario Not-for-Profit Network.
Hello, everyone. In addition to being, thank you, Maureen, in addition to being a board member at the Ontario Nonprofit Network, I'm also a senior associate at Mars, working in a partnerships role at a program called Studio Y. And wow, I have really been inspired and motivated today, and I hope you have been too. I can kind of feel it in the room after today. Tremendous amount of energy and assets have gone into this and are in the room right now. Thank you to our speakers, our presenters, the voices of the sector. Our partners who have contributed your time and effort to this day, it is not lost on us. A theme that I've been thinking about throughout the day is really the future, in so many ways. The future of our sector, of the ways we do our work, fund our work, who we do that work with. And I think our panel at lunch really brought us back to those basics. This ongoing notion of reconciliation, really starting with the self, engaging in courageous and difficult conversations. Our work is difficult at its core. This is not new to us. And committing to that as part of our work, before we do it, while we do it, building these interventions together in solidarity. I think Max said, it doesn't stop when you walk out of the office, and I don't think it ever stops for anyone in this room. That is the sector we work in. So I really took a lot from that session. And I think it's also about building and supporting future leadership. We know that 2 out of 3 leaders will retire in the next 5 years. So how are we thinking about the future? And how are we thinking about that together? How might we as a sector continue to commit to building the skills we know are needed in staff at all levels, to both work in and work on the sector, right? The mindsets and leaderships we keep talking about, those are built through experience. So how are we talking and looking about providing these experiences to all members? The people in this room, but also the people who are not. They don't have to be huge budget items, is what I'm trying to say. We know that our sector is at capacity in a lot of ways, but they do take intention, and they do take taking a second look at how you can build that capacity where you are. Fundamentals Day is a great example of that. I had the pleasure of being here yesterday as well, and it's a great way to get young professionals involved in this sector, a great chance to explore and learn about the larger trends both in the sector, so we are thinking about the work we do, but also thinking about our sector as a whole collectively. It's a great chance to explore, like I said, so think about how you're gonna, as an ED in this room, bring a young person from your organization into the conference through this day. Invite them to this day as a way to kind of open their mind to this sector and how to work in it. That's how we build a leadership pipeline for this sector, and I think that's really important. And also thinking about, who is that unlikely person at your organization? How do we open up who gets a seat at the table? How do we think differently about what a leader looks like and who they could be? And how do we be courageous in that and invite new people to the table? Because there are people in this sector that can do it. You're sitting in front of me, you look like the people in this room, you look like the city, so how do we do that intentionally? And how are you gonna commit to doing that next year? A Fundamentals Day is a great example. I am so impressed with everyone in this room and everything I heard today. And people across, even outside this room, were impressed. So our live stream today got over 100 people to join this conversation. That's amazing. Continuing to spread this message and spread the work that the sector is doing, and there is a need for it. I also have 2 exciting announcements to share. So ONN, in partnership with the Maitrey Foundation, is pleased to launch the Nonprofits Driving Public Policy 5-part webinar series. And this features the skills and knowledge to strengthen public policy, sharpen communication, create networks and allies, and build the confidence in nonprofits to really engage in the public policy process. So from frontline staff to executives to leadership volunteers, I encourage you to attend these webinars and really plug in and lean into these conversations. Yes, policy is difficult and a messy word, but that doesn't mean we don't lean in. So there are promotional postcards on the table, so I encourage you to grab one of those, and registration does open later this month. So secondly, 2018 Nonprofit Driven is going to be held in October. So October 10th and 11th of next year at the Metro Toronto Convention Centre, so changing it up a bit. So please mark your calendars, and we look forward to seeing you and emerging leaders in your organization next year. So really mark those in and put those plans in your calendars now. So we would like to once again thank the sponsors for the nonprofit-driven 2017. Without you, we would not be able to do any of this work and make this event possible and accessible. So they have done everything from sponsor the event to offer travel subsidies and so much more. It's been wonderful to see all of the stories and activities shared online throughout the day. Thanks to everyone engaging on Twitter. We'd like to congratulate Work in Culture. You're the winners of our social media contest. Yeah. So please stop by registration for more information regarding your digital consulting package. You'll all also be receiving an evaluation form in your email inbox momentarily, so please do take a chance to fill this out. It's an essential part of planning for the future, planning for next year. Tell us how we can help serve you better, and fill out that evaluation form. I'd like to also thank ONN's current sponsors, and thank our current funders and connectors for their ongoing support of our work. A special thank you to Beanfield Center, where we were today, and their team for really supporting us throughout the day. Now, finally, I would like to take a moment to thank ONN's amazing volunteers. Our leadership volunteers who have contributed countless hours, from the board to our policy committee, our working groups, our advisors. You keep the network connected and grounded. You really do. And you keep us in the know. You challenge us, and you inspire us. And to our nonprofit-driven volunteers today who you saw with those pins, thank you. You are so amazing. Registration, logistics, social media, note takers, facilitators. You weren't paid to be here, you chose to be here to support the work we do, and you're a huge part of today's success, so that is not lost on us. And finally, to the ONN staff team, thank you once again. You have gone the extra mile in every single way, and your commitment to ONN's vision and mission are simply extraordinary. I'd also like to thank Kathy for leading the charge here. Your brilliance and passion and humble leading. It's a true systems and network approach to leadership, and it's really inspiring, so thank you. You and your team live ONN's values, which are up on the screen, every single day. So I'd like to now close and invite you to join us at the reception in the Nonprofit Hub, and we look forward to connecting and continuing this conversation. And I would like to ask Victoria Grant to join us again to help close our day.
So I'm going to start by apologizing to Robin, because I told him this morning I would acknowledge the territory, and I didn't. So I'm going to start by saying that we are here today on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and New Credit, the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee, Wendat, and the Huron Indigenous peoples. The original peoples of this land. There are a number of treaties that apply to this land, the oldest being the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt. This original treaty was made between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee, covering the territories from the St. Lawrence through to the Great Lakes Basin of North America. And the other treaty that applies here is the Robinson-Huron Treaty. And most recently, the Toronto Purchase by the Mississaugas, with the agreement between the Mississaugas of New Credit, which was just settled as recently as 2010. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and home to many who came from away to this land. And we are grateful to have the opportunity to have worked here and to be on this territory. Driven. I think we can agree we have heard from a lot of driven people today. What an interesting day, beginning with Tom Delaney and Kathy Taylor. I'm sure many in the room could relate to Tim's reflection on what brings him into this work and what motivates him: family and a sense of social justice. Other words and phrases that caught my attention: entire country under stress, exhausting, moral duty. And to end, his metaphor on the red room and learning more by moving into the yellow room, learning more about the red room. Following lunch, the panel toward reconciliation with the millennials, interviewed by Jesse Wente. First, from Chris's comeback, he lets me talk first, the tone. And to folks who are in the way, baby boomers and Gen X's. I would say to Max, if he was here, that I am happy to hear that the millennials, for the most part, believe reconciliation will happen. We need them to believe. This is going to take a long time. The last point was Jesse Wente's, and I think this really is strong, and really this is where we all need to begin. Relationships, relationships, relationships. And Tim, am I assuming your paddy ride was the Red Squirrel Road? And the comment, advocacy is not a drive-by activity, it is a lifelong commitment. I think we can all feel that comment. I'm going to close today with a story and a poem. My grandfather and my father were both in the, grandfather was in the First World War. There was no connection. They didn't even have radios. So why he volunteered to fight in the First World War, I have no understanding why, other than he used to tell me he was fighting for the Queen. My father fought in the Second World War. And my husband's father fought in the Second World War. And over time, when the time that Dick and I were married, I would tell you that reconciliation was our relationship. He had assumptions, and he actually said when we got married that he didn't think it was a good idea. He actually said he didn't know whether it was because I was Catholic or because I was an Indian. He didn't know which one was worse. And over time, we had an incredible relationship because I wasn't afraid to talk to him. Over time, I was afraid of him at first, but I realized that he just didn't know. So one of the things he did was anytime I would argue with him, his attitude that we had free education, we had free this, we had free that. Coming to our community opened his eyes. Having those conversations opened his eyes. And I'm going to read you this poem, but it is a poem and a conversation that should have been had with my father and my father-in-law. And it's written by Chief Stacy LaForme from the Mississaugas of First Nation. And because it's coming up to Remembrance Day, I thought this would be fitting to close with today. So I'll read it to you. You were and always shall be my brother. We were all the same color, wrapped in the flag of this nation. My blood flowed as freely as yours. Mixed in the fields, one could not be distinguished from one another. Yet, when we came home, when the nation's colors were removed, difference became apparent. While I waited and waited, I know what you were given was not enough for what we endured. Still, it was much more than I. I am not envious of you, brother. I believe you deserve even more than you received. But it hurt me badly. I am not ashamed to say I cried. And why not? I bled, I died, I killed. Why does my country think me unworthy? The enemy I fought could never be as cruel as the people I came back to embrace. I gave so much, lived through so much, and then you, who I would give all for, you pushed me aside as if I was inconsequential. I feel as if I have been spit upon by one I honored. Do I feel good having to ask you for what should have been given long ago? No. In fact, I am a little ashamed to ask for justice in this. For I never went to war for money, for reward. I went because it was the right thing to do. And God forgive me, I would go again. This may seem an old wound to you, but it is a wound that never heals. For it is the wound of my people's heart and soul, an insult to our pride, and we deserve so much better, especially from you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So this is the time when we invite you back to the nonprofit hub where you had some lunch. There's some snacks, some drinks and beverages available for you, and we hope you get to meet everybody else. For those of you that are traveling in the snow today, and yes, there is snow, safe travels, and thank you for coming to Nonprofit Driven 2017.